if you're going to start hiring folks from different pockets and different regions and different parts of the world that you don't potentially have any friends, family, colleagues that are in those pockets, I think it's a good use of time for the organization and or themselves to do kind of like this culture training, if you will. There's a lot of culture training psychologists and consultants out there that will literally work with, a foreign national coming to a new culture and teaching them the ways of that culture, teaching them the mindset shift, the norms here. But there are consultants that will do that for an org. So going back to the training, I think it's a good use of time to bring folks that have that background that maybe do some of that consulting and coaching and sit down with us on a session or two with the hiring manager to say, hey, listen, here's how the person from the region that you're about to start recruiting from, here's how they think, here's what they're looking for, here's what they're used to within a workforce and a recruiting process. So things like that.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Freedom of Work podcast. We're going to be getting into a really interesting conversation today, and that's going to be all about how companies can embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into the heart of their culture and their operation. And I'm joined very luckily by Anthony. He is from Boundless and the host of the E1B2 Collective podcast, which we have recently featured on. So you can go and check that out after you've listened to this one as well. Anthony's experience is filled, impactful, but rather than me explaining, I'll let him jump in and introduce himself and kick that straight off. Thanks, Anthony.
100%. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm super excited. Definitely enjoyed the podcast with your colleague. That was definitely, we had a goal of where we wanted to take it, and we took it in a couple of different directions. But I think when you do that, it's always more authentic. So I definitely appreciate it. Give a high level, then maybe ask any more questions to kind of drive where I want to go. And also to the audience and to you directly, if you all see me, I have Leah on the big screen behind me, so I don't want you all to think that I'm ignoring her or doing anything like that. I always like to give that preference. But a little bit about me. So I started my career off at 19. I tell this story all the time. I was a running back in college. I thought I was going to be in the NFL. I quickly realized that my 5'10", 220-pound frame, which I thought was pretty big, was not actually that big to anyone's standard at that level. For any context of the listeners, there are 6'4", 280-pound men running like gazelles, trying to rip your head off. So that was not a good idea for me. But I came home after my freshman year. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. And long story short, there was an opportunity to lean into scaling an operation to kind of do like year-round football training. Did that with Under Armour. We did an aqua hire, and I was able to scale that organization to 400 full-time employees. And so through that experience, that put me in a very different scenario of learning the importance of culture, learning the importance of scale, thinking about just the world of work. And unfortunately, I failed in that department miserably. And so I'll connect it to the rest of my background here. During that experience, I realized that HR was very important. I realized the workforce is very important, whether you're talking about globally, domestically, and however you look at that. And so for me, I leaned in after that organization. I inevitably became a chief people officer. I started the podcast that Leah mentioned. And I've done a lot of other things around just really researching the human mind, the employee, the workplace, from both like a neuroscience and psychological safety and just human behavior perspective to a technology perspective to how do we actually do this in the day-to-day workplace perspective. So I've been a practitioner, an investor, a builder. I'm ranting now, but that's a little bit about my background.
Yeah, amazing. I really like that start to finish, because I think everyone has that journey of how they end up getting there. And I think while it's happening, no one actually knows. And I think now when we're all at this position, we realise that we've grew and we've understood the workforce, HR, why it's important, and then especially that human mind and psychosafety side of things, because I did criminology and psychology at university. I think that sort of mind behaviour also has shaped what how I work as well now. It's how people act and what they want their culture to be and their work values. And I think that sort of pulls in directly into this diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it's that HR initiative is something that is there and it's present. And I think it's definitely a conversation that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess to kind of do a little bit more context on my background, I think contextual to D and I. Look, as we all know, let's potentially get some of the elephant out of the room. Like D and I is, I don't want to be politically correct here. D and I is in a very interesting space right now in America. I think globally, right, D and I looks a lot different actually, and maybe that's even a conversation we can have. But uniquely to America right now, we're in a very unique spot. There are lots of opinions, lots of data and statistics and ROI analysis and decision making, and a lot of things kind of swirling. My background has been in three different directions within DE&I. The first has been I've actually invested a lot of resources and time building tools that were embedded from the beginning from a DE&I lens. Tools like human capability, talent assessment, and recruiting. And then during my time being a chief people officer, and actually when I first started launching a few brands, they were very much in like the consulting, D&I, change management, team alignment lane. So I have some background thinking through this, but I no means am I a D&I expert, but I have thoughts, so I can definitely share.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that D&I sits within every company, but it's different in every country, every organization, every department almost has a different fit in how they value that to themselves. And I think, especially as you mentioned, the US is going to be completely different to another country because it's not just a one size fits all program. You have to sort of embed it into what's right in those circumstances.
Yeah.
And especially when you do have a global company, if you have a HQ in the US, when you need to look at something in Europe, it's going to cause risk because you need to see that it needs to sit within every country, every tick box maybe can't be ticked, but you need to find a way to be able to manage that because it can't just be a one size fits all program.
100%. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we should sort of delve into that as much as we can. In terms of this falling short and looking at something as a standalone or one size fits all, why do you think these D&I initiatives maybe often fall short when they're looked at as a standalone and not maybe embedded into that HR as a full picture then?
Yeah, so let's connect it back to my background a little bit, right? I started my career off building a company, right? Like quite literally, that was my first job. I'd never. That was another thing I should probably throw in there. I never even had a job before I started my first business, so I had no framework of even what building a business or a company or employees or culture even look like, right? So that's just a framework here. But I say that to say, during that time, what I realized is that sales, partnerships, product, like ego of human beings, being misaligned really often, biases in recruiting processes, those things come up a lot. Like when you're starting a company from scratch, when you're a startup culture, when you're a company at scale, those are some of like the big core boxes. And I realized that if you can connect anything that you want to do from a DE&I perspective to creating more alignment, to innovating the product, to driving more sales, you will win. What happened, unfortunately, and again, I'm being thoughtful about my words, because I have a lot of colleagues and friends in the D&I sector that I respect and that I love that will kind of fit into the definition I'm going to say here, that I do believe have a place within the workplace. A lot of folks, unfortunately, took more of a racial and gender and background stance within the sector, which I think is important to note out, right? That is important, but I think that sits into a little bit of a different bucket. And I think the disconnect a lot, to answer your question directly, those individuals in the company were not putting them in a capacity to like take those best practices and connect it back to driving revenue in what I like to call a 6 to 18 month window. And I guess to kind of even dive in a little bit more, I always feel as a leader in a company, no matter what you do, everything should be driven and packaged around what will drive revenue, product efficiency, team alignment in a short window. Because unfortunately, if you go to the last thing that I said, ego, leaders are connected to a lot of that. They want to keep their jobs. Individual contributors want to keep their jobs. So the product has to stay at a high level. The company has to keep making money, and teams have to be aligned. And so a lot of times, a lot of the DEI leaders that I know and I love and I respect so much, they weren't always connecting what I thought was more of an emotional and amazing thing they were trying to accomplish to some of those core buckets.
Definitely, definitely. I think, as I said, the check boxes become too much of a checkbox to do it and not to actually get business success. I think you have to drill it back to that core business success. It comes to anything. Benefits, what certain benefits package, a 4-day working week, is that actually going to benefit them? Or is that going to reduce the workload and that going to cause a non-business success? So I think it works in the same way. It's like these initiatives are there to aid the company and to provide success. But if you aren't doing it in the right way, then things are going to break down. The product's not going to be updated fast enough. The engineers won't have enough momentum. We're going to see things breaking down a lot faster than if you were to sort of hone in on that and see what is important to that company.
Yeah, and I'll even dive in here to like provide even more value to listeners that maybe are on the cusp of if they want to have D&I inside of their organizations. Let me give you this perspective again, and I'll even call something out here. Like, I'm an African-American male. I was raised by an African-American mother. I am very big as it pertains to equality. I'm the guy that likes to see women, the CEOs of companies and presidents in film and things of that nature. Like, I am fully invested in making equality across companies. But again, to bring it back to my background, I do have that business lens as well. And so what I would want everyone to understand is that when I define DE&I, I really look at things like recruiting. Like, I'll even break that down. Not only should we recruit all walks of life, but the DE&I element, really like the inclusivity element, is how vulnerable is the hiring manager being to that candidate about what I would like to call truths within the organization, truths that look like, here's truly what the workflow looks like. Here's truly the things that frankly irritate me and I'm working on as a people leader that might make you feel a little uncomfortable at times. Here's the culture, here's the vibe, but also here are the most beautiful things about the organization. Here are the things that make us maybe a little bit different than other place that you've been at. And I think being vulnerable as a hiring manager during that recruiting process creates what I like to call psychological safety, right? So then now you can find the right person that's going to be the right fit, that's going to be aligned in the right time of the right culture that you have within your org. So even like the way that I define that, a lot of, again, folks would probably talk more about the gender and the race. But if you saw how I communicated that, I got down to being vulnerable as a hiring manager, no matter what your race, background, or gender is, so that you can lean into finding the right candidate at the right time.
Yeah, I think that vulnerability point is key, especially in remote organizations. That transparency element, you have to showcase who you are, because you can't just see it as an office space that's got free breakfasts or commuting extras. You have to truly showcase that on your careers page, showcasing it on imagery, employee advocacy, the people within your organization that are showcasing that company does have a true D&I focus. That does have to be showcased. And that transparency goes into that vulnerability of the company and showing, this is who we are. What do you want to do? Do you want to join? And how can you help us be the best we can be? I think that's a really, really important point, and opening that up to candidates to be able to explore what's already existing. And I think people also want to join and make that better. They've got, like, companies have like women in tech, or creating programs within the organization that you can be part of. And I think that's also important, to have these groups and communities and networking within the organization. So if somebody joins and even though the company's been vulnerable, they're also maybe feeling quite vulnerable. If they've got these groups and networks that they can connect with and they can be part of that, I think that's another element to making them a stronger individual within that.
Yep.
Definitely. And I think it's all starting and it's everyone's wanting to do it, but sometimes it can be a little bit trickier to get that started and making sure that you are following perhaps the right rules. And as you said, the definitions, people want to make sure they're doing that correctly.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to be standing on any specific toes. And there is experts out there that know exactly what they're doing. So I think sometimes this side of things, HR want to make sure that they're from the get-go doing it correctly.
Yeah.
So what do you think, or what have you maybe seen that something that a leader could perhaps start or help a company to sort of get that truly embedded into their DNA? And maybe so it's not such an initiative and keeping that vulnerability. I'd really like to delve into that, I think.
Yeah, I think let me keep diving down this theme, right? The first place I probably would start, like if I'm being, and that's another thing for the listeners, if you see me start kind of looking, peering into the sky, that means I'm thinking. Because I want to give an honest answer. I think the first place I would start is I would create like an 8-week sprint as a leader. And I would get all of my leaders together. And I would first try to get a good pulse of like, what are those 6 to 18-month goals? I, as a CEO and or leader, would probably create a lot of vulnerability to say, look, we want raw answers. We do not want PR answers. We will not tolerate arguing. We will not tolerate making anyone feel small for their answers. We just want the raw answer. And I, as a leader, will not take offense to this, whatever comes out. And I would give the organization different pockets during that sprint. I would go raw and honest around product, around sales, around marketing, around HR. And I would look at everything around our internal communications, some of the internal salary bands that we may have, the roles, how people are feeling within cultures. I would just get all of like the mess out. Like that's the first place to start, because when you can look at all the mess, you can kind of put it on the table and then you can connect it to, okay, here's all the junk, but here's where we want to go in an 18-month window. How do we solve some of these things? And what you'll find and what you'll notice is a lot of the inner workings are more team alignment, more psychological safety, getting more depth and more contextual alignment around who we bring into the organization at what times, being more thoughtful around role design and autonomy. All these words are like buzzwords in DEI, right? So what I kind of did was like, I kind of finessed what I just said right now, because again, I was saying all the buzzwords that DEI leaders love to use, but I was talking about it from an executive leadership presence, thinking about technology, product, team alignment, thinking about things that are trying to put us in a different position in a 6 to 12-month window. So that's probably what I would do, right? I would probably start getting all the mess out on the table, create that in an 8-week sprint, really be connected and impacted around what are we trying to solve. And then I would bring in the leaders that are great at some of those individual categories, right? Because there are leaders that are great at the smallest little details of DE&I. Like there are certain people that are phenomenal at creating psychological safety within internal comms. There are certain leaders that are phenomenal at getting the raw truths from leaders that are going to innovate the next round of product or the next motion of sales or the next HR initiative. There are leaders that can galvanize and put together teams and reposition people and create different hierarchy within teams. There are folks that are great at some of these micro details. And so I wouldn't task just one quote unquote D&I leader to do any of this. I really would rather make it more of what I just communicated, which is what I call like a teamship, entire organization initiative, and break it down in that kind of, again, that 8-week flow and structure, if any of that made sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's probably the most important part. See what you've currently got, assess that with feedback and hone in on what's already existing, because I think sometimes the problem is creating an initiative that actually doesn't reflect what's already existing in the organization, and getting feedback from the employees that are already existing there, because they know how it's currently working, maybe what's not working as well, and feedback. And I think utilizing that in a sort of this 18-month window, you can maybe do it in a 4-month section, look at how that's going, what's working from this and what's actually not working from this, maybe take 2 things out and introduce 2 new things and move it forward in a segment so that you can constantly measure what is working and what isn't. And I think this will really work having the different leaders, because people work differently and in different leadership ways, whether that's communication styles, presentations, Slack. I think the way that leaders and stakeholders act is going to
Yeah.
be different in pushing those initiatives forward. And I think that's really important, to have those leaders within different elements of the company that will see what's happening in a certain engineering team that maybe not happening in the marketing team, because people work in different ways, and it's seeing what's currently happening, feeding back on that, and constantly measuring, I think, is really important.
And I'll say one last thing too. If you already have DEI in your organization, right? Let's go in a different direction. Let's say that you're not redoing it, or let's say that you're not starting it again from scratch. Let's say you already have a DEI leader, but you're uncomfortable with their output, their role, the spend. Let's just get really transparent. These roles usually are a leadership role. Most likely they're over 6 figures. It's an investment of salary. How do we start to quantify that a little bit better? You could start to lean into making sure that, number one, they always give them a chunk of the budget that will allow them to do the things that speak to their heart. That's number one. Because leaders, we all do that across every function. Every function, if you look at marketing and sales right now, there are marketing and sales leaders that have budget and that are buying technology and tools and best practices that are more a preference of their style and what they like, right? There are certain sales leaders that use sales tools that are just fun, that they just enjoy. There are marketing folks that love different gadgets and different things and different technologies and tools because it's fun. Maybe it's not always the best of the best, but it's what they personally like. So always give D&I leaders a little bit of budget there. But then I would redesign their JD, their workflow, like literally their responsibilities, their KPIs or OKRs, and I will connect it to measuring team alignment, measuring um, measuring kind of like that first 6-month hiring alignment kind of like breakdown. Like, how aligned is this person? I would like even like dive into like, how much do we ask like psychological safety questions and really understand who this candidate is coming into the org? And then I would connect that all the way back to like just pure sales growth. So I would take the D&I leader and I would like inject them into the sales teams. I would inject them into the partnerships teams and the marketing teams, and I would make sure they have a big hand there. And then I'll just measure that ROI in a year. And
Yeah.
then if things still do not seem productive, then you have an argument to remove it. So you see where I was going with that? Like, but don't just remove it proactively based off of headlines and PR and things of that nature.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like all about what we're speaking about. It's embedding it into that DNA rather than adding it as a program just to have it as a program. And I think that's the exact reason you plug into those different teams and you see how they're actually working. And yeah, I really like the budget element, because I think it's nice to see what different leaders will do. I think if they can straight away try something that they maybe have done in a previous organization, or maybe an upcoming tool that they want to try out, I
Yeah.
think something like this is good to see how they work, and just to get the ball rolling really quickly. I think the fun software and stuff does also help with productivity, because
Yeah.
I think if you're using a product which is a little bit more fun to use, I think you're enjoying it. So productivity and your workflow is a lot higher and you're a bit more engaged in what you're doing. But if it's a black and white software that's boxes and plain, for some people, that will just be really uninteresting. They won't want to log on, they won't want to do their work. So I think that budget option is a really great touch, and making sure
100%.
everyone's aligned with that and seeing what works and what doesn't, and measuring that is really important, definitely. I think that's a really good point about, as we talked about, embedding that into the organization. But I think it's really important that if the organization is global, it also gets that step harder. And I think whether that's remote, global, hybrid, it is important to look at that on a geographical basis. So I'd really love to sort of go into this as more as honing on the regions and the diversity of this. And I'd love to sort of think what you thought about how companies should approach this sort of fair pay, benefits element across these diverse regions, and maybe without falling into, as we've discussed, this one size fits all doesn't work. But yeah, I'd really love to hone into this.
Yeah, so I think a couple things, right? The first place I would start is kind of really thinking about like leveraging a multi-market kind of benefits benchmarking analysis, right? That's a fancy word for saying there are private organizations that will benchmark what your people need, right? That can look like a survey, that can look like one-on-one conversations, that can look like market regions, market in regions, salary expectations, benefit preferences, ways of life, ways of working. What challenges are these folks facing based off of these regions? You know, I talk about this all the time. If you are a global organization and you have certain employees that are located in what some might call maybe a third world country, or someone might call, an area that just clearly has more poverty, or an area that clearly has more political, things happening that might impact someone's technology accessibility, that might impact someone's ability to show up with the most joy or psychological safety every day. I think that should change your benefit strategy. Having a global benefit strategy does not make sense to me. Everything needs to be audited based off of where those individual employees are and what those pockets of norms and those I call them like natural behaviors. What are the natural behaviors? What are the natural things that are happening? And how can we look at, again, salary? How can we look at mental health? How can we look at technology? How can we look at accessibility? How can we look at even things like recruiting? Like, how can we look at different ways of recruiting and getting in front of folks, and the questions that we ask and how we set up the recruiting process? All of that should be diverse. All of that should be very inclusive to where they are and where they're working. And again, there are external consultants that you can use to benchmark where you are in comparison. Let's say you're an enterprise level organization listening today and you have offices in 50 countries. There's companies out here that you can spend a nice little bit of money, but I think it's worth it to then do a benchmarking and just understand, how do you stack up in some of the most major categories of benefits and or equity and or some of the finances and salaries that you can offer to your employees. How do you actually stack up and rank in those areas so that you can understand where you may need to lean in and work? And then I would take those individual leaders and managers in those regions, in those pockets, and I'd get that real-time data. And again, that can be surveys, that can be one-on-one conversations, but I think they're humanistic. I think they're real, right? I don't think that they're fluff. I think that you really look at, okay, like mental health areas. I talk about this a lot here in the States. There are certain, I'm sure this is happening globally, there are certain pockets where folks are just predominantly more in a poverty, riddled and just uncomfortable environment, right? Maybe they are warehouse workers and you can't pay them much more than 14 or 17 or 18 bucks an hour. And the money you're giving them is not going to be life changing. So they probably have a second job. They're probably living in a tough area. Your benefits package should look a lot different than a benefits package that has 80% of their employees that are engineers making over six figures. The things that those individuals need are going to be different. And so that's a whole rant to say contextualizing and humanizing everything benefits wise from a global lens is very vital.
Definitely. I really enjoyed your term multi-market benefits benchmarking. But it's key because the real-time data, the on-the-ground data is key to you finding, again, what's going to be successful for your business. And you need to look at what competitors are there as well, because if you're wanting to engage and retain that top talent, you're going to have to look at the competitors thinking, oh, actually, their pension percentage is actually 2% higher than ours. Why are people leaving? Oh, it's to go to there because they've got more of a pension. But that might be somebody who's perhaps over the age of 40, for example, and that might be only for them. So it's trying to see what maybe in a certain team, what their age range is, what there is preference to them. They might need more money at the moment because they're saving for a wedding.
Yep.
They might be having a child. The benefits for that individual will change year on year. They might be now wanting to settle down, so they don't need a hybrid workforce anymore. It's going to be constantly changing. So this real-time data is actually from the employees on the ground in that business, and you're going to need to see, okay, so half my team have gone to that company because it's more money, and you have to constantly change that and see how you're going to retain that top talent. And I think it's really crucial.
And all those categories you just named is why I think at least 3 to 4 times a year, you're tracking data and questions and feedback from individual employees around those data points, so that if any of those employees leave over the course of time, you can look at that percentage and now you know this is why they've left. We need to do something about this. I'll call out, I'll give a shout out and call out of a product that I've always loved. There's a company by the name of Compt that does personalized, they call them LSA benefits, that does a beautiful job of this, that takes that DNA and that core psychology of, we need to understand what individuals want in all these different categories: personal, mental health, workflows, what we need inside the company, what we want to endure and experience with our families. And it's all contextual to where they are and where they're at in their life. I'll even do another call out to a mentor that I've always loved, that I think a lot of us probably know. Gary Vaynerchuk has talked about this a lot, where he said that Claude Silver, their chief people officer, does an audit on a yearly basis to understand and break down the company in different pockets. Our 21 to 30-year-olds, our 30 to 49-year-olds, are over 50. What are the trends there? What do these folks need? What are they looking for? What do they want? Making this analysis happen every couple of years and seeing, well, what our 21 to 30-year-olds wanted from 2019 to 2022 is different now in 2025. And why is that? And how do we need to redo and change, contextualize our benefits globally and just domestically? And so these are things that I think about. Like, if you notice a trend, it's always like asking questions. It's thinking, it's analyzing, it's trying to make as much as you can, everything to be personalized down to like the individual human being of one, is the way I usually think about things.
Yeah, I think so as well, because every individual need is unique to them. And I think it's important to understand that, whether that's from a benefits level or, as we say, the D&I across globally, it's all going to be different to that individual. And it's up to the company to understand that there's not a one fits all, and like this sort of pockets that you keep suggesting. I think that's really crucial, because there's different pockets, but also the pockets can cross over depending on who it is and what they do. And I think it's important to, look in and see those trends, how they're changing. I think if we look back 10 years, maybe from like 2020 to in the past 5 years, it's changed a lot more faster than the 10 years before that. And I think that's because technology is constantly changing and evolving on a much faster rate. Things are changing, work from home, remote working, startups. 90% of startups are actually starting as a remote first workforce now. So I think that is constantly changing, which also changes this benefits a lot faster. So I think it's really important to measure and understand that.
And to tie in the D&I angle again to global, if you're a company starting anywhere and you're immediately hiring everywhere, like you're immediately hiring folks from Ireland, from parts of the UK, from parts in Africa, to parts here in America, to Germany, you're hiring everywhere. And you're doing so because you want to tap into the best talent. You're doing so because you want to tap into the best minds. You're doing so because you want to, have a very diverse product, as well as a very diverse set of understandings of markets. I'll divert on a tangent. Bring me back, because I think this is important. I've also thought about diversity and equity and inclusion from like creating a product that is separate than the market. So I'll explain what I mean. If you know, for an example, you're building, if you're New Balance, and you've seen, I hope you've seen this, and other people have been seeing this. If you're New Balance, they've redesigned their entire internal, let's call it manager to executive team of folks from pockets of what we call in America, inner cities, urban areas, because that's where their customers are starting to trend now, right? New Balance used to be like an old dad shoe. Like my dad wore New Balances, right? They're the most comfortable shoe. It feels like you're walking on a cloud. Okay. And that was great for a long time. But you know what happened? The kids started getting involved. The urban cities started getting involved. And they're like, oh, we need different colors. We need different colors. We want to redesign this. We want to start wearing New Balances with certain styles. And what New Balance is starting to realize is that the executives they had were not innovating based off of that new demographic and that new pocket. So they had to redesign that. That's a DE&I initiative. That's thinking about who are we trying to sell to in what markets globally and domestically, and who has that background. So if you know that, I'll use a music artist as an example. If you are a music artist, you have a team, and you know that a lot of your fan base is in Africa, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a manager and leaders on your team that are from Africa. I think that makes a ton of sense. I don't think it makes any sense to have someone from Iowa. All right. Nothing against Iowa. I have a great friend that's from Iowa. I love him. But I don't think that makes any sense. And so that was a whole tangent to say, and I don't know if what the first question was, but that was a whole tangent to say DE&I from a global lens should, again, always be connected back to where are my customers? What do my customers think, and how do they make buying decisions? And do I have that knowledge internally within my org? And how can I be very mindful of having a borderless organization to be able to tap into what the consumers are wanting, not what I selfishly want as a business owner?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and something that maybe a lot of people don't think about. I think as we've been discussing and we've sort of got to this point, it's all about the internal side of things, but actually you have to look at why you are creating this product, who you are creating it for. And I think that will exactly shape who's going to be working on the product and who's going to be working there. And I think that's a really good point and sort of story to showcase that exact thing. And I think it sort of goes into this designing these systems and making sure that it is at the core of the business and perhaps the product as well. I'd love to sort of go into and pull into this sort of inclusive environment, especially in remote teams, and think about what an inclusive recruitment environment looks like in practice for remote first companies,
Yeah.
global companies, distributed teams.
Yeah. I have a couple of thoughts. I think the first is like hiring manager training on this. Like that's a necessity. Leah, really think about this practically in your career, right? And I'll do the same. We don't have to say this publicly right now if we don't want, but I'll start. The percentage of folks that I know are recruiters over the last 10 years of my career that have had training when I'm going to describe is like 2%. None of them are having training on how I'm going to describe this. They're not having enough training on getting very, very, very clear about how the applicant on the other side would like to work, communicate, how they think, how they truly want to fit into what already is within the org. A lot of hiring managers are not trained on being very authentic about, and I kind of talked about this earlier. I call it like going beyond the brand, being very honest about what's happening beyond the brand, around things like workflows, pitfalls, micromanaging moments that still exist, things that we're working on, things that we're great at, things that are going to be really timely. Like if I was a hiring manager or if I was leading a hiring team, I would teach my hiring managers, like, listen, we're going to do a little workshop and understand how these next 6 engineers that we're hiring, what are the like 5 things that if they hit it out the park, what would that mean for us strategically and emotionally as an organization in the next 6 months? And here's how you should articulate that in the interview process and get a gauge on if not only can they do it skill-wise, but are they naturally and behaviorally attached to that, right? Like that's a very different thing. And I just don't think a lot of hiring managers are ever trained on this. I think a lot of hiring managers come from agency. I think a lot of hiring managers and recruiters come from worlds where they kind of understand like the tactical nuances of hiring and recruiting, but not the psychological and the DE&I elements and um, the timely alignment type questions. So that was a whole rant to say training for your hiring managers will be the number one place I would go, and I can give more if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to say, I completely get this. Like, I think coming from agency, people sit and they have so much experience on getting the right candidate, actually, and a great cultural fit. I will probably say they're great at that, getting them the right job and probably getting them the right salary expectations. I think if the candidate's happy in that aspect, they feel like they've probably done their job. But I also think from the hiring manager side, sometimes when they ask the questions, can you tell me a time at work where you failed and what you've done to rectify this? Sometimes a lot of people answer in a way that they think the answer should be and not actually something that shows what a pitfall is to them and maybe how then, if this was to happen in this new company, how that would be rectified. And I think, again, as you said, what's something great that you've achieved in success and what did this do for the business? This also pulls into this, what you do great, what you do badly, and how they can help in the company. I think sometimes people are answering it in a way that they're trying to cover that star thing. They're trying to hit the subject, make sure they're applying everything right to get through to the interview process. But sometimes I think they're just doing that to hit all the points rather than to actually showcase a bit more about themselves. So I think another part of the interview process would actually be good to say, okay, now you've got the job, let's actually discuss that a little bit further. I know you said this, and this. Is this something that has happened recently? Was it
Yeah.
a few years ago? Has something changed since then? Maybe is there other things that we can help you while we know that this could be something that can happen in the future? Doesn't need to be a negative thing. I think people need to realise that sometimes the interview process, having these questions is just to get through. But I think it would be good to have that additional thing from the HR person to say, we're actually using this to
Yeah.
see and applicate and create that communication style that will be best fitted for you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think and also thinking about it from like a global lens perspective, um, I often think about again, kind of connecting training. If you're going to start hiring folks from different pockets and different regions and different parts of the world that you don't potentially have any friends, family, colleagues that are in those pockets, I think it's a good use of time for the organization and or themselves to do kind of like this culture training, if you will. Like understand there's a lot of in the work that we do here at Boundless, like there's a lot of like culture training psychologists and consultants out there that will literally work with a foreign national coming to a new culture and teaching them the ways of that culture, teaching them the mindset shift, the norms here. And so that's another thing too. And I just realized I didn't even make that announcement either. I lead partnerships at Boundless as well. So that's also in my repertoire, my skill set here. And we're doing a lot of great things in the immigration sector and global workforce sector. So just want to make that quick plug. But there are consultants that will do that for an org. So going back to the training, I think it's a good use of time to bring folks that have that background that maybe do some of that consulting and coaching and sit down with us on a session or two with the hiring manager to say, hey, listen, here's how the person from the region that you're about to start recruiting from, here's how they think, here's what they're looking for, here's what they're used to within a workforce and a recruiting process. So things like that.
Yeah, I think that's really vital as well. And I never knew that actually existed, someone that can teach them the ways of what that culture is going to be like. I
Yeah.
think also in a remote setting as well, you're going to be working with people across the globe. And I think especially in the UK, we can be quite happy and chirpy in our communication, but perhaps someone in a different country may be a little bit blunt at communicating, or will say a point but don't mean to be rude in that, and that's just in their culture. And I
Yeah.
think it's important for people who are working in remote organizations to take a step back and not maybe take that too personally, because people communicate in different ways and that culture is put through communication.
Yeah.
I think that also would be great to plug into maybe a HR in that first instance, because some people can feel that the communication maybe is a little bit blunt or rude, and people aren't meaning to be like that. They're just wanting to communicate their point. And I think that could also be put into that first initial onboarding and things. Like, you are going to be working with people across the globe. Don't take anything too personally in that communication. If you feel maybe that something has been taken a little bit off, then communicate that back and keep that communication through, because that foreign culture is completely different in every country, and it is. It is.
And then the last thing I'll say on that is, and I empathize with this a lot, because I am a very different employee, right, than most, right, and I say that because with my unique background and my unique circumstances of how I got to where I'm at, my workflows show up differently. My communication style, based off of where I am, geographically, shows up differently. I'm a New York, New York, DC, Philadelphia, East Coast, direct guy. But I work with a lot of folks from Seattle, a lot of folks from LA, a lot of folks from San Francisco, a lot of folks from, around the world, frankly, and the Midwest, the South. And so what I've had to learn is that my style and my approach is not always the best. Direct, I think being direct and honest is definitely always what you want, but how you do that and the thoughtful nuance of how you get to that level of truth, that shows up differently, again, from a global perspective, or different pockets of here in America. And I guess I'll say that to say that being mindful about, just because someone doesn't communicate and or act in a way that you're used to, it might feel a little uncomfortable at first. I see this a lot when I start companies. Like, sometimes it's a little uncomfortable for the other person because they're not used to that energy. But what I want you as a hiring manager, I want you as a leader to think about is, are they breaking any core value rules? Probably not, right? Are they not doing their job well? Probably not. But they might be bumping up to is, maybe this is not a personality type or a way of working or communicating that you personally are not used to. And that's okay. And if you can just keep your eye on the prize of, maybe as a hiring manager, I'm going to create a little bit more psychological safety. I'm going to take ownership in this and maybe lean in to learn more about them and understand why this East Coast or down South or whatever the case personality that I'm experiencing, how does that show up for them? How does that create psychological safety amongst their friends and their culture? And how can I lean into being more comfortable with them and only judging them off of if they violate the culture, right? I'm a big fan. Like, if it doesn't vibe with like the core standards of the culture, I get that. And obviously judge them on their performance, but don't judge them off of how they personally show up, based off of where they grew up and based off of how they are used to working. That's a final rant, but I think there's a lot there too.
Yeah, definitely. I think we could speak about that aspect all day, but I think it's also pushing towards this, obviously, this everyday culture. And as we said, it's not just an initiative. And I think it's really important, almost mindset shift for the people, the employees, but also the HR leaders, leadership stakeholders. And I think making sure, as we said, if people are maybe feeling a little bit vulnerable, we need to make sure they're not feeling excluded, because that's the last thing that any company wants. I think with remote teams, it's not like you're this flashy remote team, but it's like, actually everyone's just sat at home individually, and people need to make sure that they're not feeling left out and they're not feeling excluded. And I think that's also a key part to like remote teams and making sure everyone is feeling included. I think this can creep in, especially in a remote environment, but I'd really sort of like to delve into this, perhaps where remote teams may feel unintentionally feel excluded, and how leadership and HR teams can possibly spot this early and prevent this from happening.
Yeah, I think there's this little tiny like moments, right? Disengagement within Slack conversations. disengagement on just like remote calls and team calls. You're seeing a certain, like, there's ways to track this. Like if you're using simple tools nowadays, you can track talking time, looking at those metrics. You can track the amount of ideas that they've thrown out. There's even tools that, well, this kind of gets into the AI world, but that'll analyze body movements and facial patterns and things of that nature to kind of get a read on like sentiment and things of that nature. A lot of those tools and a lot of that leaning in should be done remotely, because you don't have the opportunity to bump into them at the water cooler or on the way to the bathroom or in the lunch break. Like you don't have the opportunity to do that. And so you don't have those spontaneous moments to see, oh, their heads down, or oh, they've been quiet all day. You haven't seen them all day. They're literally in their own bubble until they get into that meeting. And so you have to do things like intentionally reading and analyzing those talking time metrics, utilizing those tools. There was a great company I worked with years ago called Equal Time. I think they're actually still doing their thing, where they literally are tracking things like that, where they're getting very deep into sentiment and analysis and understanding how someone might be feeling based off of certain data. And then I think the other way too is putting remote leaders in an intentional position to create more one-on-one moments, and literally that one-on-one is about what we're talking about. Like literally the one-on-one is about, how are you feeling in these categories? How are you feeling being a part of this team? Are you feeling like your ideas are heard or at least being tested? Do you feel like the continuity and the workflow and the way that you're rolling out your initiatives within this organization and this team works well? And then the last thing I like to lean into is like thinking about like utilization rate. That's another question I love to ask is, I'm a leader, right? So it's like, hey, Leah, you're on my team. How do you feel like your utilization rate is? And you're like, what does that mean? And it's like, well, everyone has like 100%. Let's call 100% is capacity. That means you're burnt out. There's nothing else you can do. Are you at 80%? Are you at 75%? Like, where are your energy levels? And then you're like, why? And it's like, well, when you get to 100, you're going to burn out at some point. That's not good. I don't want to see that from you. But if you're at 60, is it because you're potentially disengaged? Is it because there's more work that we could give you? Is it maybe that we need to take your opportunities and get you kind of like some collaboration moments with your teammates? So I think that utilization rate looks like workflows, looks like bandwidth, but really looks like mental health state and just a check-in.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as I think every conversation I've had recently, everyone will always bring up AI because it's here and it's happening and people need to embrace it. It's got such amazing tools, as you said, face analysis, like the things that it can start doing now. And I think HR teams need to embrace that. I also think this constant communication is great if you are starting in a remote team. Something like an onboarding buddy is really great. I think someone that's not in your team already and someone that's maybe even been at the company for a little bit longer than you, but is in a completely different team, because sometimes the questions that you want to ask your manager and team members, you don't want to ask your manager, but you could ask your onboarding buddy. For example, how many days off leave do we have? Maybe you wouldn't want to ask your manager that because you're only in your first 2 weeks of work. You don't want to seem like you're already trying to book time off. But your onboarding buddy would know all of these questions and answers. And I think it's sort of another PIM person to speak to. And it makes that element a little bit more comfortable for somebody who's joining remotely. I also love these one-on-ones. I think they're crucial, and highlighting these percentages of where you're at, because sometimes I think when you have to vote likely, most likely, and I enjoy the percentage of work because it gets you to see where you are at as well. I think sometimes people don't sit down and actually analyze what percentage they are at, because they are working, and then once they're done with the day, especially as a remote worker, you're still in your house, or you may be at a co-working space, for example, but you're still at your laptop, and people can be working into the night, 10 p.m, just to make sure that they've done their work, and so they don't look like they're slacking at home. And that's not what we want this to be. This percentage is, if you're doing 80% over the 5 days, that's fine. But if you're doing 90 to 100% over the 5 days of work, something needs to change. Do you need to hire someone for your team? Do you need to do that? And if you do need to hire someone, it's clearly because we've got a lot of work, which is good for the business because it means we've got a bit more business success. You've been hired and you've caused that. But the good thing is that you do need someone. So you should never be afraid to shout up if you have a high percentage of workload or you're feeling burnt out, because there's always going to be something that can be helped there. I think that's really good point to make.
1000%.
Yeah. And honing that in and spotting that early, because if HR leaders and also managers can spot that from a remote workforce, I think it's going to be beneficial to everyone in the global team, whether they're junior, mid, senior, leadership, directors. Even directors need to be checked in on because they're going to be working very hard. And I think it's at all points of the business, everyone needs to be checked in on there. I think we've honestly had a really amazing conversation, but I think it would be great if we did some sort of closing top tips, pointers to see, and round up exactly what we've spoken about today, because it's been interesting. We could probably go out from it for about 3-4 hours, so maybe I can get you back on and we can finish up. But I would love to. I love this prospect of like myth busting, because I think it's something, especially in D&I, something that's talked about a lot. I would love to ask, what's one D&I myth you wish more leaders would challenge?
I have a lot here.
No.
I think there's like a myth or like just a perception that D&I is really just like a culture, gender, race, program and policy initiative. I really think, like, I'll be very blunt about this. I'm thinking. I want to be thoughtful. There are a lot of leaders that are really good at what they do. Okay. So I'm talking about the top 1% of an organization, the CFOs, the head of product, the head of sales, the head of marketing, the CEO, some of the folks on the board. A lot of them do not study what I like to call human behavior, psychological safety, mental health elements, the true nuances of what I think is embedded within DE&I. Like, that's just not something they study, not something they lean into. Like, the vast majority, I'm sure there are some, but the vast majority don't. And so I think knowing that as a true, like, state of, like, that's not your natural state. Like, these are not topics that you've put 50 to 100 hours of research in. Marketing or sales or product is definitely where you spend a lot of your time in. The myth comes in where you assume that you can speak on DE&I topics when you actually don't know what you're talking about, right? And I try to say that as most politically correct and professional way possible, right? And the myth is, you then take that bias, you take that point of view, and then you embed it into making bold statements or bold moves of, we're going to remove this program and or this DE&I leader because of these buzzwords or these moments that you actually don't know anything about, right? So the very first myth that, like, I would try to bust in that is to understand more about that if you want, or your best bet, and I've always said this, your best bet is to go and get a D&I based recruiting firm, have them educate you on what the role should be in the way that I've described today. And I think you'll find that it's more aligned with what can actually drive value in the business and not some of the things that you're afraid would cause a disruption in the political kind of like landscape and PR of your company or your own personal biases around gender or race. Did I do a good job, Leah, of like being very thoughtful in that?
I think so. And I think it's definitely what everyone's thinking. It's that myth of those people thinking they understand, but there's just so much more to it. And I think we only just scrape that. And yeah, this idea of mental health, psychological safety, that psychological element, I think, is a really important thing. And people who study that, they have a really high knowledge of that. And I think that's really important to look at. And then I know we've spoke a lot about all different points today, but I would just love for one takeaway, if they could go away from this conversation, and maybe if they wanted to start, I know you suggested that the 8-week sprint, but just something if they could take away from this conversation, what do you think that would be?
You know what? I've been big on this in my personal life and also in business, so I'll do this. The biggest advice I would give is if leaders that hold budget and make the decision on if this is going to exist in the company can just do this first step, take accountability, and then you do not probably know a lot about the inner workings of how this can make an impact in your business around product innovation and revenue. Right. So I went into a different direction than a lot of people probably assumed, right? Don't just take accountability in more of like the emotional conversations. There's enough content out there for that, right? Take accountability that you do not understand how DE&I can connect to making more money, making your product stand out. That can impact how you will create your outbound sales strategy or how you will position your product in new markets. If you don't understand that correlation, raise your hand as a leader, say, I don't understand the correlation. I probably should be curious about that. Take accountability on that. And then the next step of that is always, anytime you take accountability and ownership in anything in life, you usually go get a coach, you usually go spend some money to fix it. You usually dive into then learn what the next step is going to be. So accountability and ownership and admitting is the very first step that I've realized can solve pretty much anything in life.
Definitely. I love that. I think that's completely sums up how like the D&I has to be part of a company, and you have to be intentional, you have to listen to your employees, and you have to design a culture that in essence creates business success.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't, then really, is there a point in it? So I really like that summary and just putting that back to that first core point of why a business is a business. And I think that's really important to embed in that in the DNA. But yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. Honestly, this conversation could definitely go on for hours. There's so much depth to this topic, and you could unpack certain areas and pinpoint in this for hours. So thank you so much for sharing all of your insights, your energy. You're so enthusiastic in the way that you speak, and I really enjoyed that. And for anyone who's listening today, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I'm sure we'll be delving into topics much more like this one and maybe speaking to Anthony in the future. And also go and check out his E1B2 Collective podcast, where he speaks all about different topics within this industry. But thanks so much again. And I'll see you all next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Freedom of Work podcast. Bye.